Thank you all for being here and for staying. We are delighted, of course, to be here with you. And I will ask a couple of questions and we will have a conversation, and I hope that we cover all of your questions as well. I remember Sabina Krayambu years ago, you coming to me and saying, Janet, I read your book, Desert Queen, and I would love to make a documentary about it. And then I didn't hear anything about it for years. So what happened? How did you come to make the film?
It was one of those coincidences. Ziva and I worked on a film together called Ahead of Time. Ziva produced a film.
What's your microphone?
You want this one? Ziva produced this film ahead of time, and I edited it. And it was about a woman named Ruth Gruber. And Ruth Gruber, in her life, she was an incredible trailblazer and spent time in the Middle East. So I was pretty sure she would know Gertrude Bell. And when I asked her, she had no idea. And Ziva said, oh, I just read the biography by Janet Wallach. So both of us had individually traveled in the Middle East and were just fascinated by Gertrude Bell and her story and how inspiring it was. And we decided that she would make a great follow-up. And that was about 8 years ago. And then it took us 3 years to get our schedules aligned. And we spent the last 5 years making the film.
And I spent 5 years writing the book, so we've put a lot of years into Gertrude Bell. Ziva, I know that you worked a great deal on the footage, and it is the most spectacular footage I've ever seen of the Middle East. Tell us how you did it.
Well, that was really one of our very first challenges when we thought about embarking on the documentary. We really were concerned that we would find enough footage, and if we found it, what shape it would be in. Because we were looking for 100-year-old reels of film from the Middle East. As it happened, one of the people that I had worked with for Ahead of Time, I had established a really nice relationship with the University of South Carolina. And so just sort of randomly, I called them and said, I'm looking for scenes of the Middle East from Iraq, particularly from 100 years ago. And it was just this most remarkable coincidence. They sent us footage, and the very first footage that we saw for the film, it was in the film at the very beginning of the round guffa boats and the men unpacking the crates on the harbor in Baghdad. And we figured that if that was our first phone call, that we were very potentially in a good shape. So, of course, then after that, we spent several years looking through more than 25 different archives all over the world, and we had gotten a collection of over 1,000 film clips. 500 film clips are in the film. So.
Absolutely amazing. The way that you did the film is so unusual and works so well. Sabina, tell us a little bit about how you came up with that idea.
Well, first of all, it was clear to us that the letters are just stunning. Gertrude Bell's letter would become the core of the film, the narrative, would build the narrative. And but we always felt we didn't want to make a traditional documentary. You know, historical documentaries are usually done with experts talking about the different topics, the different people that appear in the film, and we didn't really want that, because also once we started to get this archival material, it was really our intention to transport the viewer back in time and to tell the story firsthand. And so we came up with the idea of the actors, which everything is based on primary source material. So all the interviews that we staged with actors were taken, the statements were taken from primary source material. So it was either autobiographies, or it was memoirs, or it was letters that we found, or sometimes it was political communiques, and we transformed them into first-hand interviews. And it was an amazing experience to cast for the film with British actors. We shot in the UK, and we made sure that they would seemingly integrate into the film, so we decided to shoot with film. We shot Super 16 millimeter, and so it gives it the quality, the texture of the film stock, flows very well with the archival material.
Of course, the voice in the film, the voice of Gertrude Bell, is actually the voice of Tilda Swinton. Tell us what that was like, meeting her and working with her.
Well, we knew that she was our very first choice. She would bring something really interesting and unique to the film, and she has this, she's so intelligent, and she's such a brilliant actor. And one of our executive producers is friendly with her.
That helps.
That helps. And we reached out to her directly, and she was interested in doing it. And so that was very helpful too, because this was a tiny documentary with the 2 days of audio recording that her agent would have easily just never have returned our emails. But it turned out that Tilda Swinton had been cast about 10 years ago as Gertrude Bell in a feature project, which never happened because unfortunately the director died and the screenwriter died of that project. So she was intrigued when we reached out to her. She was really intrigued and interested in doing it, and brought all of her, collaborative, wonderful collaborative generosity and her intelligence. And we talked a lot about what Gertrude Bell should sound like. Should she have a super upper class accent? Should she sound like she was from the north of England? Should she have an Oxford accent? And what we decided on in the end was Tilda Swinton's natural accent. Which we think works really well.
Yes, and it was funny because when we showed the film, we were invited to a symposium, the first Gertrude Bell symposium in London at the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, very early on. And we had just put a couple of scenes together with a stand-in voice. And after the screening, there was a huge brouhaha about, and the discussion started, how should she sound like? And the thing was, in our research, we found when people described her voice, it was described as shrill and very high, and we thought that will be very difficult for 90 minutes. So Tilda's very pleasant, soft voice really allows for people to watch for 90 minutes.
It's funny that you said that about being shrill, because she smoked a lot. I always thought that she had a kind of a husky voice. And in fact, there were a couple of people in real life that I used as kind of models when I was writing the book. And one was, some of you may have actually met her, the woman who owned the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem was Gertrude Bell's niece. And she was very much like Gertrude Bell. In her 90s, she was traveling all over. I would go out there, and they'd say, "Oh, sorry, but she's in Moscow, or she's in South America," and she had that kind of energy and drive and intelligence, and she looked like Gertrude Bell, but she had a she had a very nice voice, and more that throaty cigarette sound to her. Yeah. The other person that helped me a lot was writing about King Faisal and what was he like. And I had spent time with the late King Hussein of Jordan, who was the great nephew of King Faisal. And he looked like Faisal. King Hussein looked like Faisal. He had that charm. He had the intelligence. He was a ladies' man, so it was very helpful for me to have those role models. But one thing I wanted to ask you, because you had Tilda Swinton, did you just get oodles of money for the film?
Well,
That would have been so wonderful, and we would have done it in 2 years.
Well, that was another challenge that we faced, of course, was the financing, because history films don't grab a lot of people's interest. So we applied to many, many funds, but most of them were devoted to funding social issue documentaries, urgent stories, advocacy pieces, impact, quantitative films. We were very fortunate to get 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which we cannot plug enough or often enough, because they were really wonderful, and they had a grant that was named Bridging Cultures Through Film, which our film was like a dead ringer for, actually. And so we were able to do that. We did a Kickstarter campaign. We got a small grant from the New York State Council on the Arts, and then we had many wonderful, generous supporters. And also we did a pre-buy with Arte France and Germany. We did a British co-production, so we got tax rebates. Oh, you can't. I mean, it was a huge puzzle that we put together over a period of time, as all documentary filmmakers do.
Yes. And you've mentioned several countries. I know that you showed the film really around the world. What's the reaction been like in Europe, and what's it been like in the Middle East?
Well, it was very interesting because our first Middle East festival was in Beirut, and we were thrilled to go there, and the festival was wonderful, and we won the audience award, which was really great. So far, that was the only place we have shown in the Middle East so far, but we just have gotten an invitation to show the film in Baghdad next spring, which we also can't wait to do. And in Europe, it was also so far, the UK, we had a big theatrical release in the UK. The BBC broadcast it, and it was very well received. And I think it's been, and then we're just showing it in Amman on December 18th. So it will be very interesting to see it in Iraq. You've been there. We haven't actually. Because we were dealing with archival material and worked remotely with people in Iraq. But you have been there. What was your perception of how people perceived Gertrude Bell today?
I was in Iraq in 1995. It was actually illegal for an American to be there, and it was a scary experience to cross the border from Jordan and to go through no man's land and then to be in Iraq. I was very fortunate that I had an invitation from the foreign ministry because I knew the Iraqi ambassador to Washington, and then he was at the UN, and he knew that this was a serious project that I was doing. And so that gave me some sort of protection. There was no American representative, there was no American government officials in Iraq. There were no Americans in Iraq. My late husband and I were the only Americans there at the time. The Iraqi intelligentsia knew the name Gertrude Bell, and they were very curious about her. And they wanted to know more about her, and they opened their archives for me. They opened the museum, which Gertrude Bell had created, and it had been closed because of the war. And it was phenomenal. Many of you have probably seen the rooms at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They look like nothing compared to the friezes, the Assyrian friezes in Baghdad, and the amounts of fabulous pieces that were there. It's an extraordinary place and an extraordinary thing that she did. They were very welcoming. The Iraqis were very welcoming. They really wanted to know more about her, and I think recently they restored the bronze bust of her to the lobby of the museum. I'm pretty sure. Yes. So it was an incredible experience to be there. Yeah. I always thought that I was kind of glad I was writing about Gertrude Bell after she died, because I felt like she would have been so intimidating. I would have been too nervous to actually interview her or really. What were your impressions of her?
Well, I think that intimidating would be a good word. She was somebody who I could imagine you would admire her from afar, but she did have a temper, and she was not shy about, her opinion about you, no matter what that opinion was. So I think she's not somebody who you necessarily would have had a charming time over lunch, although entirely possible to have a charming time over lunch with her.
I think we would have had to learn Arabic first. That actually makes me think of one of the things that we were really very careful with in the film. You saw there were Arabic-speaking parts, and we were very careful in the casting of these actors, as well as in their performance and in the way they spoke Arabic, because when we did our audition, we got all kinds of dialects, Egyptian, and and the reason we knew is because we worked together with a woman who had been a translator. She of Iraqi origins, and she happened to be the mother of the young woman who plays Madame Jamil, and so she was really on top of all the actors to make sure that their Arabic was absolutely Iraqi and would not be mixed up with any other country. So that was an interesting aspect as well.
All right, there are two questions that people always ask, so I'm going to ask. First of all, do you think that she was a virgin?
Well, she actually made a comment, I think, didn't she, that she was surrounded by men, but she's going to die a virgin? I think we read that quote somewhere. We think she was a virgin. We think she was a virgin, but something that was really interesting that didn't make it into the movie is in the description in the letter that we quote from Frank Stafford, the private in the film. He said, apropos of nothing, I mean, he's writing all these reminiscences, and it's very useful and very interesting. And then he says, by the way, just to let you know, I think she was perfectly normal sexually. Like, totally out of the blue. And he says there was never any whiff of impropriety. I mean, it was just one of the things he was thinking about, I guess. But we think she was a virgin.
Yeah. I read those letters with Dodie Wiley over and over and over again, and between the lines and under the lines and everything else. And I don't think that romance was ever completely fulfilled. But then I wondered later on, when she was taking trips with St. John Philby, the father of Kim Philby, the British spy, and she was taking weekend trips with him in Iraq. And there were others so who knows? I
think she was a Victorian deep down, and in a way very. That was also what made her such an interesting character. She really had always two sides On one hand, she was so progressive, and then she still gave in to her parents not wanting her to marry the person that she loved, and a very open and opinionated woman, and somewhat public, but then also extremely private and reserved. So I think that is really what gives such wealth, and makes you create a discussion, like, what was she really like?
Definitely. She was so sophisticated and so urbane in some ways and worldly. And yet when her father said to her, "Come home, we don't like Mr. Cadogan,"
She did it.
She did it. She was the Victorian daughter who went home and waited sadly. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he died. Yeah. Not that long after. And what about her death? What do you think?
Well, we have different opinions. I personally believe that she did commit suicide. I feel that we can detect over the course of her life the depression rising, and if I were, and I'm obviously far from being a psychologist or anything like that, but I think there was something bipolar in her behavior. She could be so like over the moon and extremely happy and like almost like sickly happy, and then at the same time a few days later be deadly depressed. So I believe that, but Ziva has a different opinion, and we did ask we actually were fortunate to meet family members of the Bells. They live in England, and they were wonderfully welcoming and gave us access to their photo archives. And they told us that her niece told us that the family came to the conclusion that she did commit suicide, but Ziva has a different opinion.
I believe that she did commit suicide, but I think it was more of an impulse. I could really sort of imagine. We know that she was depressed. Mm-hmm. We know for many, many different reasons, including one that doesn't make it into the film, that her half-brother, Hugo, who she was really, really close to, died the February before. And so there were mounting sadnesses that she just couldn't get out from under. But I could really so clearly imagine, because she was also a risk taker, that it was, she took her sleeping pills before she went to bed. She woke up at 3 a.m. She decided to take a few more, and she said to herself in my fantasy, if I wake up, that's good. If I don't, that's okay too. I don't think it was a thought through sort of, I feel like it was an impulsive moment. But we won't know. We'll never know.
No. We'll never know.
Shall we ask any questions from the audience?
Well, we'd be delighted to take some questions, but with a proviso that no speech making. It's got to be just the question. Okay.
Yes, up here.
I'm sorry. I understand how you got to this movie, which was fantastic. But how did you come to write the book?
I had written several books about the Middle East, and the one that I had written before this was with my husband, and it was a biography of Yasser Arafat. And I was so thrown by him. He was such a confusing and distant and difficult person to understand that after that I said, I want to write about a woman because I think I'll understand a woman much better. So I want to find a woman who was actually important in the Middle East. That's not an easy thing. I thought about Golda Meir, and I figured we know a lot about her, although there's a new book out. And Cleopatra, and there were no primary sources. And then Saddam Hussein crossed the border to Kuwait and declared the 19th province. And there was a small article in the newspapers blaming some British woman for the borders of Iraq. And I thought, how extraordinary. A woman created those borders. And so I did some research and talked to some experts in the area and historians. And each person that I spoke to just raved about her and said she'd be a fantastic subject. And she sure was. I'm still looking for another Gertrude Bell. If anybody knows anybody like her.
More to say about Lawrence
The question is, does she have more to say about Lawrence than we have in here? Well, they had a very energetic friendship relationship. I think that she was, for the most part, well, I don't know. It sort of ran the gamut. She was, for the most part, found him to be very smart, and she was, for the most part, respectful. His letters are much more, have a wider berth, because in some of them he makes fun of her clothes. And, he was very competitive with her, we got the impression. But she was 20 years older than Lawrence. So their relationship was, she seemed to be, she liked him. That's not the right word. Like isn't the right word, but
yeah, they saw eye to eye on the Arabs, and they were much closer in their perspective, their way of thinking about the Arabs, much more sympathetic and empathetic towards the Arabs than most of the British, particularly the Arab Bureau in Cairo. So they hung out together. They dined together. They worked together. I think Gertrude Bell was kind of resentful because she had just come from that trip to Ha'il, and she had met Ibn Rashid. She knew a lot about the Arab tribes. Lawrence didn't. Lawrence had never been there. And so when the British decided that they were going to back the Arabs in the Arab revolt, Gertrude Bell wanted to be the one to be the liaison. She was the natural one. She had been doing all this intelligence work. When they gave the assignment to Lawrence, they said to her, you provide him with all your knowledge. Mm-hmm. She was a woman. And so there was a lot of resentment on her part.
And then she was totally cut out of the picture. Because
and sent to Basra.
In terms of history, no one ever heard of Gertrude Bell, but she's the one who made Lawrence's famous journeys possible because of her notes.
Right.
And Lawrence was one of the people that recommended her for the post in Basra over some low-level major baker who was going to be potentially taking her job, but she ended up getting it. And I think also their opinions sort of diverged during the Arab Rebellion, where Lawrence was feeling that they were going too far, but he was long removed from the Middle East. He was back in England.
What is the draw of the
Middle East?
to the Middle East?
Yeah, just an amazing fact that they all went and were disguised as men. They could have been killed.
Some did. Some went disguised as men. Yes, it's a wonderful book. They were all very romantic travelers. None of them really did anything, but they traveled to the Middle East. Yes, and part of the draw is just the weather. It's so depressing in England the whole winter. Seriously, Gertrude Bell always left England before the onset of winter. She was, well, what did she say in the film? How many Christmases she had been away because she did not want to be in damp, cold, dreary England. So I think for a lot of the women that was it. And in some ways, for all that exotic travel, I think it was easier to travel as one of the British Empire, especially if you came from an important family in those days. All of this was, the British considered their territory, and they had lots of protection, and they were Gertrude Bell got mail all through her trip through Arabia, all through the Syrian desert. It's incredible how the British Empire functioned. So it was very different than we tend to think of it.
The question is about the 1920 Arab rebellion and the bombing of the villages. Well, A.T. Wilson was the High Commissioner at that time, and he and Gertrude Bell really hated each other. And she had very little impact on the British decisions. He did not welcome her advice. He did not pay attention to anything she said. So those bombings really went forward without her input, to say the least. And in terms of the lasting effect of those bombings, well, I think they probably affected the tribes to hate the British, is probably the effect they had.
It is considered an important part in Iraq's history. In fact, we were lauded several times by Iraqis that we included this chapter because it's usually not in the history books, but it means a lot to Iraqi history and to their independence movement, and they really are thrilled that we talk about it and bring it up and make a little chapter about it.
I was glad to see it as well. One more question, John.
One more question.
You had a question?
Oh, I was just, because I think of Gertrude Bell as a critical figure in the Middle East, but I think of the lumping of the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shias all into one country as also an essential problem that resulted from that partitioning. I wouldn't have expected you to address that, but I just wondered if you have thoughts about her effect in retrospect. I mean, apart from what you just brought up about the bombing, which is, of course, important that she had opponents to what she might have enacted had she been more involved in government behavior later. But I mean, the appointment of a man from Morocco as the head of, et cetera, it's all pretty complicated and pretty imperialistic. So I just wondered what you think about that.
Yes, I mean, the inclusion of the Kurdish territory as being part of Iraq was obviously a very strategic one on the part of the British. Gertrude Bell is often, people say, she created all the borders of Iraq. She was mainly responsible for the southern borders. The Kurdish borders were created after her death. But she was a proponent because of the reason of the Sunni majority up there. And of course, in retrospect, that area has been contentious for so many years, and in retrospect we can all say that was absolutely not the right decision. It was a territory that to this day is being fought between the Turks and the other countries. So we didn't really go deeply into it because really the decisions were made after her death, but it came up as part of the reasons also why they chose Faisal. I mean, Sunni majority was really, and to get the Sunnis to rally under one king was what they had decided to do.
And they knew there was oil there. So, but, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.